computer. Hi, everybody. It is January 21st, and welcome to the Tinderbox Meetup. We've got our cast of characters. Don't see Mr. Bernstein with us today, so we'll move on without him. And the typical format of a Tinderbox Meetup is for us to go around the room. Anybody that's new introduces themselves. I don't see anybody new. So then the next step would be talk about the projects we're working on, which Steve Hart is going to jump into in just a minute. And then after that, assuming we have time, we can pull out any arcane, crazy demo stuff that like Mr. Anderson and myself, Chuck, or others have been working on to kind of melt people's brains a little bit. So with that in mind, why don't we jump in? So Mr. Hart, kick us off for the day.
Sure. The question was, what's my current project? I completed this past week 2 sessions in series for the organization that I work at about capturing requirements as part of IT, as part of software development. Primarily, we're going to be talking to business users. We'll be using a platform. Just to throw out some names, I work in the Dynamics 365 customer engagement space, a Microsoft enterprise software, which is largely a platform which is designed to be configured for the specific business. There's Magento, which is another tool we use, which is for online commerce. And so we have this recurring need to be able to understand what the business needs and translate that into a working configured system. We're not building it from scratch, but we're taking an existing platform and making either small or substantial updates to it. And I needed to really boil down to what exactly I wanted to present, taking into consideration my audience, who are primarily people with sort of a project manager type of hat that they wear. They are not technology people and like coders or programmers, but they work closely both with the business users and with the people who are doing the configuration and coding. And I use Tinderbox, no bones about it. I use it largely as an outliner, just to sort of collect my thoughts. And there was something sort of meta about it, because part of requirements is sort of taking a lot of disparate pieces of information and trying to apply structure to it, and then validating that structure with our business users. And the same thing that I was going through in preparing the presentation, I had a whole bunch of different ideas. I had to consider how to present it, what level of detail, going from whole to parts, high-level view, detailed view, and order of presentation, and that kind of thing. And an outline is a very helpful tool for that. Michael, before we got started, was showing how he's built up tools in Tinderbox to be able to take an outline and convert it into a presentation, which I think is a very powerful kind of thing. One of the things that I presented in finding requirements is that there's the elements that you can sort of figure out the structure of the world, as it were, and break it down into its pieces, but then bringing it all back together, and concepts of design and how best to present that. And it's not a criticism of taking an outline and creating a presentation out of that, but basically real presentations take that and then take it a bit further, and then say what will be most evocative, what will be most impactful to the audience. And that's not something that I found is easily captured within a Tinderbox outline.
So can you say that
Where
again?
things are,
Can you say that again?
combination of words and pictures and diagrams that may themselves have words that show relationships, those kinds of things. And this is sort of one of the revelations in what I was presenting, is when you're looking at requirements, not only is it for software, it's not just the requirements on their own, but what is also of great value is the relationships there. So that's that's my introduction.
Yeah,
Lot
but
of things to chew
can you
on.
go back to the point you stated before? What was difficult about Tinderbox outline when you said something that it was challenging to do?
Well, in an outline, it's the hierarchy represents some kind of relationship, and it's textural. And often what we're trying to communicate, and not only the content, but the how we are communicating it, is not something that is strictly in an outline. It might involve pictures, it might involve shapes and lines. Some of those shapes might have words themselves in them. They might be oriented in certain ways, using distance between the objects to represent something. And ultimately, you want what is presented to be effective, impactful, evocative. And those are things, there's more of the emotional sides of things that are very difficult to capture when you're using a tool which sort of strips away a lot of that and just is talking about a hierarchy.
Yeah, and actually, it's interesting you brought that up, because this has been a mostly backstage, but somewhat front stage conversation over the last 10 days or so, I would argue. It's been around for a lot longer, actually, a couple of years, but it really, and I'll be the one to blame for it, has come back up in the last 10 days or so, in that I have a similar desire for you, in that I do most of my thinking in outline, because I've learned how to abstract most of it out of my head. But a lot of the times, though, I will want a map, I will want a picture, I will want illustrations. And I can show the demo I was giving before we turned on the recording, and I can pull in pictures or I can pull in videos. But especially if you're doing requirements documents, more often than not, you want to illustrate some form of system design flow. This function connects to that function, it relates to this, they've got to come together in this order. And more often than not, a requirement may have 3 or 4 sub requirements that have to get built first before that main requirement can be created. And that is often best illustrated in what we'll call a map view. The challenge, though, that we're facing right now is, and again, Mark Anderson, maybe you can chime in on this a little bit, this distinction between what map view in Tinderbox currently is versus this new idea of a flattened map. And they're very different things, even though they both use the term map. And I think that it would behoove us to spend some time on that discussion today, not just for us to be able to help the community make the distinctions, but I also hope, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, to Mark Bernstein when he listens to this video, this desire for the community to have this kind of new view that we're asking for. But before we get there, Mr. Gale.
Hi there. Good morning. Steve, I found your comments a bit heuristic, and what I mean by that is that Tinderbox is certainly a vehicle, but one of the things that I think kind of escapes people is, when you're doing a presentation, what's your goal? What are you trying to, is it just a training that you're walking people through a PowerPoint so you can check off a box that everyone has, received certain information? Are you trying to brainstorm? And then you becoming, how should I put it? Are you just the button pusher and the PowerPoint is essentially talking? Or are you getting to a point in the PowerPoint and then you reclaim your identity as the speaker and engage your audience, and either engage your audience by telling them something compelling without them having to look at visuals at the same time, or you elicit feedback from your audience and try and have a dialogue. And one of the things I kind of like about presenting in Tinderbox, and I've done it more for just business type meetings where I need to go over things, is that I remain the focus and the information kind of becomes secondary to how I want to guide it. Whereas with PowerPoints, and in a way, the more elaborate the PowerPoint and the more information in the PowerPoint, the more the speaker themselves become somewhat diminished. And anyway, these are just some things that I think about. And also, the size of your audience. If you're talking to 400 people, that's a completely different presentation than if you're around a group of 12. So I find this whole thing, it strikes me that there's a lot of legs to it.
Yeah, no, that's really good. So I do want to keep us down this thread. So yeah, Steve, how do you want to react to that?
So the foundation I sort of keep in my mind is how people learn best. And you look at studies about spoken word, written word, visual presentation, and so on. The old adage, "Picture's worth 1,000 words," is quite true. So I can be the focus, but also being able to put up images that, if you're trying to make an impact, audience and other things aside, you have to understand where they're coming from and so on. All of that is, very appropriate. But being a talking head has its limitations. Or if that is your main focus and you don't put much on the slide in terms of words and pictures, you're only speaking to some segment of your audience. You can't know ahead of time how to reach them necessarily. So you kind of need to use various methods in one slide or one phrase and across your whole presentation. So, and the other thing, and my intent of bringing up this topic is not that I expect Tinderbox to do everything. I use it as a tool, and I'm not looking to one tool to do end-to-end kinds of things. Although the topic has come up about flattening Tinderbox, to me, I don't really have a strong interest in that, frankly, because its role in my workflow, I think I have much more mature tools in my toolbox than what Tinderbox is today, or what you could conceivably see Tinderbox providing 5 years from now. And that's perfectly fine by me.
Yeah, I don't want to challenge you on that a little bit, but I don't, but I do, in the sense that, because yes, I agree that there are other tools to make prettier pictures, but when you're in the thinking, and I think this is often, how do I want to word it? So, and I'm going to pull in Mark Anderson. I'm going to put him on the spot in just a minute, because he and I were just talking about this, like this idea, like literally 10 minutes before this call, like this idea, like, why are we so fixated on visuals when we're thinking? And this idea that a picture speaks 1,000 words, that's true. But as a presenter, is it the 1,000 words that you're actually trying to convey? And, the artist or whomever creates that picture, they need to go through those 1,000 words ultimately to get that picture built. And I think and sometimes it takes many iterations. For example, I'll do many rough maps and pattern flow diagrams and architecture diagrams in Tinderbox. And once I have my thinking straight, and once I've defined it, and once I've put attributes around it, and once I've sorted all and cited all of the material, in other words, once I've got my thinking straight, I'll then want to move it out of Tinderbox into Pretty, where into maybe another diagram or a fit for purpose workflow diagram that then is enterprise grade that works with other players within the organization in a more seamless way. But I find Tinderbox really, really valuable for that preemptive thinking before it gets out into something more pretty or more fit for purpose for those types of enterprise uses. But Mr. Anderson, let me put you on the spot. Can you help explain to us the difference between traditional map, this idea of flattened map, and the image of 1,000 words concepts?
Yeah. Well, I'd first thank Bruce for reminding us in lectures that is in so many things in life that size matters. So on that note, actually the sort of debate about flattened maps has been going on since I think I first turned up to use the Tinderbox wiki in 2004. And the sort of problem stems partly, I suspect, in the genesis of how Tinderbox maps, which were inherited, I think, broadly from Storyspace, which was used for writing literary hypertexts and has roots going back to the 1980s. And this is always an interesting thing with Tinderbox, compared to many PKMs that have just, say, oh, wiki, we can redevelop that and make that new, and they prop up kind of thing. And they're interesting, but there's not so much substance behind them. There's quite a lot of backstory in a good and bad way into Tinderbox. And the thing that I'll admit has really only come to me just recently is that trying to flatten the map is solving the wrong problem. The sort of flattened maps that people talk about are much closer to something like, I don't know, the Obsidian graph, this sort of thing, that whether or not they're strictly force-directed diagrams, essentially that's people are saying, just show me the map. And ironically, that's already in Tinderbox. It's called the hyperbolic view. I have views on that. I mean, I think it could do more, but essentially it's already there. If you want to see your flattened map, go and look at hyperbolic view with the limitation, as in most other things that graph out stuff, is it has to be linked in some way. But it's also the case
and by the way, there lies one of the requirements rubs. And let's go back to the beginning of the conversation of requirements. And I think this would be helpful for us to try to document along this way. When you're doing this type of, and again, my view of, you understand what I'm trying to get at. So you'll get to defining flattened map. But at some point, when you're going through the process of trying to flatten a map, or it's from an outline, not necessarily from a map, I don't necessarily know what the linkings are yet. And that's where hyperbolic falls down for me, is hyperbolic only works when there is already pre-existing links. Whereas when you're trying to do the map view, I don't know what the links are yet. And
well, I get that.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my uses, one of the things I want to be able to do, it's not like the hyperbolic map, is to sort of say, well, why is there so much dark matter in my map? Why is there a hole here where clearly nature dictates there should be some substance here and there isn't. There's a big hole in my map. But that's actually quite difficult stuff. But what I've come to see is it's this interplay. People start in the map because the map is the diagram you're shown, by and large. And it is, and has been for a long time, Tinderbox's USP. But it's stored as an outline underneath. It has to be something. I mean, well, I guess you could say if you were starting completely from the ground up today, you might flatten it out completely like a wiki does. They're just articles, and then you confect things between them. But in 2002, when Tinderbox came along, that was probably a bit advanced thinking. But I think trying to flatten maps, it keeps going aground on the fact that, well, the classic thing comes up, so, well, I only want to look one level down or two levels down. So I think the software can cope with that. It has to cope with whatever you throw at it. And if you throw in something that's nested 7 levels deep, it's got to cope with that. It's no use saying, I won't do this or this can't happen. That's just not how software rolls. you know, it has quite hard edges, thinking of requirements, you know, and you have to color inside those lines, especially when you're engineering it. And then looping back to Michael's comment about this exploratory thing, and one of the things I've suggested that we need is almost something more like, if you think how attribute view and crosstabs view work, don't worry at the moment what they look like, but you basically go to you open a view, say I want to see this part of the document, perhaps filtered by an agent, and then I want to do stuff with it. So what I posit is something that could probably use much of the map view code in terms of the visualizations and little affordances and things. But basically what you're saying is show me this part of the document and then let me draw with it. So I use that term deliberately because I'm saying when I come back, I want it to look exactly like it did before. That's not exactly how maps are. They broadly are, but they have some subtleties. They came from a different place. And my feeling is if we try and shoehorn the former into the latter, all we'll end up with something where everyone is unhappy. It'll never quite work because there are too many pieces smushed together. Whereas if for instance, you had a view where you could say, oh, you know, you might say, right, this part of this set of notes, even if they're not an outline at the moment, this set of notes, this thing is my, you know, my scope. And I'm going to draw a diagram in it. This is my process diagram. And where those notes live are not dependent on, the picture I'm drawing is not dependent on where things live. Then I think you're probably getting to the area you want, because an issue that's also bedeviled Tinderbox along the way is another one that's been around for as long as I've used the app is about aliases and maps and links. The problem comes that one of the things that Tinderbox, one of the earliest things it did, because if you take story space, smush it together with Web Squirrel, which probably none of you ever met, and look sideways at it, you get something that sort of looks like Tinderbox. So it's a hypertext tool for making websites, because blogging was a thing back then, even if it is now still. And so one problem is if you want to export an alias, and it has all its parents' links, you get links going to all the wrong sorts of places. Plus the fact that where does an inbound link go? Does it go to every alias? Does it go to just the original? And Tinderbox falls along the line of it's basically optimized in that sense for export. So it sort of works. So you can make a link to an alias, and when you export the Tinderbox, the link from the note you export will go to the alias rather than its original. And this is why essentially people say, well, why is it that when I make an agent to find all the things that I know are, you know, a map in any other form, they don't turn up with, well, it doesn't look like the map I expected. And that's part of the explanation. And this is why it's really an idea that really came to me in the last week or so to say that, yeah, what we need to de-interleave is the completely fluid map thinking space, which by accident of birth happens to be based on an outline container, and have a way of divorcing it for that and giving us something that's much more of a visual sketching tool, sketching, drawing. The point being that it's the person rather than the program is in charge. So if you go and open up something like, look at the Obsidian graph, it draws you a force-directed graph using a force-directed algorithm of the things you created links for. And this is not a bad thing, but it's certainly not a Tinderbox map. And so that's why I think there's room for an extra read. Oh, Chuck, do you want to chime in here or before I sort of rattle on? No, okay.
Yes, I did.
Yeah, so do, please.
You're heading exactly where I was going. So I will just set a little bit of context and maybe shift the thinking a little bit. As I mentioned last week's meetup, I've been doing some work with CAD tools for personal projects. And one of the things that I've encountered as a difference between different tools is the way they handle layers. And layers turn out to be a very complex issue in CAD drawing systems, and one that's very controversial. I was reminded of all the discussions. And then I said, well, I need to catch up on what's going on in Tinderbox. I went over and started flipping through all the various things that have happened last week in the forum, and went over to the backstage and read the most recent postings associated with the flattening of maps. And I said to myself, gee, what we really need is we need to divorce the drawing of a map from the original Tinderbox view of it. What we need is the map sandbox, was what I thought. And I think, Mark, you were saying just that just now. And in a sense, the problem I think a lot of people run into with Tinderbox is that when you take a note and you move it on the map, the coordinates for that note, the attributes that reflect the coordinates for that note, are updated. You then try and look at it in a different view, you then run into conflict with how that gets set up. And what I think we probably want is we want the ability to say something that is not quite layers. I don't want to imply that it's not quite tagging in the way that it's described in other situations, but it's that we would like to be able to say, in my Tinderbox document, I have multiple map sandboxes, and I can place any note into a map sandbox and have it take on the coordinates of that map sandbox that would not conflict with the coordinates the note has originally. In other words, we need multiple levels of coordinates, and not every note will have coordinates in every map, every sandbox map, but I think that approach would give people a lot of flexibility. Then you could go the next step and say, once you create that structure, and now we can have notes that belong to different maps, you can actually say, what do we do about links? And maybe we could say, links of all this type automatically appear on this map, or we selectively allow only certain links on a map, which allows the user the complete control over how they want things to look, but still keeps everything connected to the notes and the links that are part of the inherent document. So our knowledge base remains intact, but we can then create different views of that knowledge base and not be encumbered by the way the software works. Yet at the same time, I think this is not a particularly hard problem for the software to deal with.
Yeah,
You could then go a step further and you could say, well, now we try different force schemes, or we give people some tools to automatically create a sandbox view based on some criteria. And I think that would probably take Tinderbox quite a bit further for a lot of people. So I throw that idea out.
And just to add to that a little bit, I mean, you really summarized it quite well for me. And again, the key part for me is this idea that what I think misses a lot of people, and I think, Steve, I understand why you wouldn't want to use it in the way I use it, because you do have other tools that you will use to kind of do your work and all that happen. But for me, I've gotten to a point where, for instance, I'll write, literally last year, I think I wrote probably one 450-page report, two 200-page reports, and 98% of all of the content was automatically being published out of Tinderbox. The only time I would ever go use any other tool would be to make it pretty. But all of the thinking, the images, the videos, the audio files, the map diagrams, all were being developed in and out of Tinderbox. And I have this very extensive system diagram I built that had maybe 500 notes on it in the map. And then I had to start generating aliases and all of that to make it work. And I got it to work. But having this flattened view, to which Chuck and Mark were doing, would have saved me countless of hours. And again, I didn't need pretty; I needed thinking, and that's what. And I think this is where I think Chuck and Mark are referring to. Yeah, Steve.
So it quite intriguing. The value that in sort of translating something into a map is not just me and me impressing my understanding on the relationship, but also having automated tools. Hyperbolic, great layout tool, and then our map tool has some basic layout tools within Tinderbox. But for me, that's not as powerful as some of the other tools that I use that have layout algorithms, probably 10 different algorithms, and each has about 10 different parameters that I can change for each one. and I can run it through a sequence of these various different layouts and can see structures that I didn't see before.
Mhm.
I would applaud you if that's where Tinderbox wants to go, but just realize once you go down that route, if you want to replace what tools that I use and perhaps other people's use, you're going to start to in order to be sort of competitive in my mind share, you're going to need to have those different layout algorithms,
Yeah.
and the ability at a pretty fine grain level to be able to adjust those algorithms so that I can go through a sequence of things and say, oh, not only does that tell me something else about the information I have, but that's a better presentation of it than something else, some other way that the algorithm has been adjusted. It highlights the right kinds of things that I think are important, and puts at lower levels or in a
Yeah.
less obvious place.
Yeah, and let me jump in on that real quick, and then Mark. I think I want to go back to a point you made earlier. Tinderbox can't, not, nor should be everything, right? There are tools that are designed specifically with the algorithms, like, and all of the. That's part of the reason why I still why I love DevonThink, is DevonThink has the natural language, artificial intelligence processing engines to search documents that Tinderbox will never be able to do, right? Your tool that you just explained has capabilities that will never be able to do. But I presumably that is probably an enterprise grade license to which, or maybe I'm just guessing, or it may be yet another suite of tools. I don't think we're asking for Tinderbox to do all of that, but I am asking Tinderbox to do the beginnings of that, to help me learn that may be ultimately to what you just described where I need to end up to. But I don't know, and this, Mark Anderson, this reminds me a bit of what we've been talking about with the gentleman in the forum. Like, I want Tinderbox to get me started to know where I need to go, but if I can't even get started, I'll never know where I need to go. So Mark, maybe you can comment on that a little bit, and as well as you raised your hand.
Yeah, let me just round out on the maps thing. It's really interesting what Steve Hart said, because well, you can't see my bookcase, but it might be pointed out to some of the family I've overindulged in books on visual design. But the depressing truth is, when you dial down on most of these things, they're nearly all hand retouched. All the really cool pictures, which is something we should not look beyond, because so all these force-directed graphs, and then what actually happens is people get away down that way and said, well, it's really fancy. It was super, but actually it doesn't tell me anything, because all that's happening is an algorithm is basically making things not collide and taking one end of my outline, connecting it to the others, and drawing it in a radial thing with a few whistles and bells. And I don't mean to speak ill of the people who design the algorithms, but there's something particularly complex at that level about it. And the real joy of PKM tools, and in this sense I include Tinderbox when they work, is they actually allow you to get up close with making knowledge, and that's hard work, and it should be, because you're making something that doesn't pre-exist. And we tend to, I think I've sort of wrote this to Mike, I mean, we have a tendency, we fall into this trap that we want to increase serendipity. I mean, this is the promise of the Zettelkasten. If you just put the crap in the right boxes, suddenly, instant success. I'm not sure that went for Lerman. He was just using the tech of the time to keep track of an awful lot of information. And he happened along the way to make lots of associations and write lots of papers, but he made the associations. It didn't happen because he was woken in the middle of the night by a Zettelkasten rattling and said, you should read cards 42 and 86. But that's sort of where we are. So we get fascinated by the process, and we keep trying to take the human out of the loop. I find sort of the personal knowledge management, or the knowledge management process, most interesting when the computer's broadly staying out of the loop. What it's allowing me to do is to capture things which otherwise I can only manipulate entirely in here. And it might have been David, somebody asked me about, VM. Well, funnily enough, VR, sorry. Someone last year, I got dragged into a forum of people looking at VR. I'm not a complete booster. I think it's got way further to go for work and this sort of thing than we imagine. Because things like games play fast and loose. You don't have to draw the back of the saloon you're looking at. You just need to, like a film, you just need to show the bit you see. But people actually just mentally elide past that and build all these wonderful mind palaces. I have played around with, funnily enough, a thing called Noda, which is, you can do box and line diagrams in 3D. It's on the Oculus. It's quite interesting. But what I quickly learned from that is or was reminded of is the promise there is actually not the extra dimension so much as having a large and infinitely programmable space. And then you come back to the fact that we don't yet have the tools to program that space. But when we do, what it allows you to do is effectively have, a screen this big. And as we know from the way our eyes work, it doesn't have to all be in 5K completely. So once you can do gaze tracking as well, you basically draw in detail the bit you need. And suddenly then you have these enormous elastic thinking spaces. But I, for one, don't think that's going to arrive this year, next year. It'll take a while because there's a lot of complexity. The interesting part also that came out of that was realizing that the difficulty of moving data in and out of these environments. And actually, if you have stuff that's relatively structured, it works well. So whether you're working with something now like JSON or even just say HTML, that's a pretty good start. Which made me think back to, sorry, I'm drawing lots of threads together, Steve's point about these layout diagrams. Well, okay, that's fine. If you've got really specialist algorithms, as long as you can run the algorithm and extract, say, the UID of all the objects and maybe their link, they're basically their link relationships, there's no reason that you couldn't actually import that into Tinderbox and put it, say, into a non-dynamic flattened map, because you want a diagram that you can do a different sort of transformer. So say, right, okay, so I now understand what the diagram looks like. Now I've got to do other stuff with it. I need to populate it with more metadata, or I need to do some, I might need to do some sort of fine tuning to understand some of the detail. So, and that chimes with Michael's point about not having one tool for everything, because that way madness lies. You just end up with a subpar implementation of, you probably one good thing and everything else is a bit subpar, and then you just get angry and frustrated. And you don't use all these other wonderful tools that do those other things really well because you convinced yourself you don't need to, and that's the sort of self-defeating aspect of it. So if the interchange is there, and that's something that I think broadly, and given its age, Tinderbox is actually remarkably good at. And it's a lot less sort of brand or format agnostic than a lot of the current crop of tools around it. I do worry at the number of things where I was watching something on, well, I'll not name the product, but basically, in order to say, I ate a sandwich today, you type #I/ square bracket 8 pound something. And I think that is not how 99% of humans think or write. I can see how it appeals to a lot of people who code all day because it has the same sort of abstraction, and that's no bad thing. But where those people go wrong is thinking this is something that we should give to everybody. And I'm thinking, no, they will run screaming from the room and they will not thank you for being exposed to this. So, I mean, that's one of the, again, what I like about Tinderbox in that sense is actually quite a human tool. Yes, there's complexity, but to be perfectly honest, you can sit down and you can write close reading notes as you might have done 40 years ago on paper in Tinderbox, and your experience will be none the worse for it. And if that's what you need to do, that is a perfectly good use. I mean, we tend to talk about much more complex use of the diagram here. And that's why it's interesting, the thread that Michael mentioned earlier, where someone said, it comes up a lot. Someone said, I just need more demos. I'm thinking, no, you don't need more demos. Because all that happens is you look at somebody else's map saying, I want that's set in a complete different domain to your own. And then even when you've tried and attempted to implement it, you say, well, it doesn't work. Well, of course it doesn't work because it's for a different domain in a different person's brain. What you want to be doing is abstracting the ideas. Oh, right, so I can capture this sort of information. Or saying to yourself, what are my sources in my workspace, and what are my outputs? What am I trying to do with it? In other words, which is a sort of non-techie way of saying, what's the metadata I need? You know, in order to find stuff, what do I need to be able to find? Because if it's not there in the source, you're not going to find it. And in a sense, putting a load of text in Tinderbox and then just using a contains search and everything is a bit like driving a race car in first gear. You can do it, but it's ugly and it sounds horrid. But it's fine, and it's if that's what you want to do, you can. But I don't think that's what most people aspire to in the use of the app. So I'm looping right round to this thing of flattened maps, because flattened maps is another one of these sort of things where we think that the answer is, if only I could just see it all at once, the magic serendipity would flip in. And I've done this long enough to be unconvinced of that. I share the same hope, but I've been disappointed enough times that it's slightly worn away. But the tractable part of that, I think, is that being able to move more fluidly between the canonical storage of Tinderbox, which is an outline for better or worse, and also is the core structure for export, which is also important if your work needs you to take information out of Tinderbox. Having a map that relates just to the notes in scope rather than their stored structure is probably quite powerful. And what I see in that is, so a lot of the affordances you see in a map, like drawing flags and shadows and all this sort of thing, can probably be reused. And interestingly, I don't know, it was probably Chuck said, when talking about the hyperbolic view, that one of the things that I've been asking for the hyperbolic view is less sort of highlighting the link I'm interested in. It's things like, no, actually, I only want to see this link. And sometimes I want to see all the things it's linked to, or I want to see all the things in scope, including the things that aren't linked. Why?
That's the big one.
Because they might need to be linked. This is when it starts to get sort of exciting. I mean, it's complex, and I think one of the problems that people probably look at the hyperbolic view and go meh, is that leaving aside sort of the people coming from linked data and semantic and all that sort of stuff. No, just the idea of connecting things for a purpose, recording that purpose, and then doing quite simple sort of questions based on it is actually remarkably powerful. But it's kind of thing most of us aren't trained to do, because most of us go to school with beaten rotten and told, write things down in order, just write it down in order, and wonders will ensue. And so many things, the kind of things that bring us to this forum, don't work like that. They are they're multi-narrative, they're multi-threaded, and they don't want to fit in one box. Or you can fit in one narrative, but you're conscious in doing so that you've left a lot of things out, and not all the readers will be satisfied with the solution you've posited. And this sort of links back to what sort of Steve was saying. Different people are going to need a different cut through the same data. And the one thing that I've really taken on board from the odd 19 years I think I've been writing ATB Ref is that one of the biggest challenges for new readers it's the boundary of the hypertext. Once they know what to look for, and this is nothing to do with indexing, it's all to do with the sort of the vernacular and the point of view with which you arrive. And most of us arrive running from the experience of what we've used before. And so for most people new to Tinderbox, the one thing it isn't is Tinderbox. And the thing that can be remarkably hard is to sort of shim in, and in the moment, something that says, right, what you call X is actually called Y. And when you think of this, think of it in that way. But that's a really big challenge, I think, in documentation generally, because the same occurs. Between your reader's eyes and the page, you need something that sort of goes in between and said, it is not quite what you think it is something, but is not quite in the way that you think it is. And that's a real challenge, but a rather fun part of the whole knowledge thing. And I probably prattled on long enough, and I'll pass over to Chuck.
Well, I guess I'm really just trying to amplify some of the points that have been made here. Just as a reminder, I've confessed this before in some of our meetups in the past. My area of specialty is networks. And going back to the late 70s, early 80s, people started thinking, and one of the reasons why I have 3 leases in my basement is, graphical computers were, viewed as a great way to start mapping networks. And people, of course, meant more than just computer networks. People were thinking about all kinds of networks that exist in the world. And, so I've been looking at this problem from how do we translate something that exists physically, but probably exists in a complex systems environment? And how do we draw maps automatically from the information we know about that system? And somewhat like you, Mark, I've come to realize that's very difficult to do. And in fact, in most cases, all attempts to automate drawing a map fail, bluntly. And you'd say the most obvious thing is networks. They've got wires. Just map out the wires. And that will not tell you what the network is doing, unfortunately, a physical computer network, or an electrical grid, or transportation networks. And we tend to think of transportation networks as being all about, where you drive. But some people drive to a train station, hop on a train, go to the train station, go from there to the airport, get on a plane. When you start looking at things that way, the traditional physical models that people have poured into our brains don't work the way we need them to. And so my reason for getting interested in Tinderbox was the hope that I could capture critical information about systems I'm working on, or knowledge that I'm trying to gather, and find multiple ways to organize that graphically. Because graphical views are, the pictures that are worth 1,000 words, if we can make them and make them useful to people. And I think that's still a very big challenge, and it's something I'm still hoping to make some progress on with Tinderbox. But I think it does call for some new thinking about how we map stuff in Tinderbox, and I think that's what we're discussing here. Nothing wrong with Tinderbox as it is, and I absolutely agree that the greatest value of it is you can start small. You can just start by typing stuff into it, and that's different from what we do with DevonThink, and as a good example. And I'm also a DevonThink user, and I just can't imagine trying to do everything in DevonThink in Tinderbox. That wouldn't work. That wouldn't make any sense. So I think that nor would I even want to consider trying to map everything I've got in my DevonThink database. That would be impossible to even comprehend, because it's a mess, intentionally so. And so I guess I'm just saying, I'm trying to reinforce the points that we all have complex relationships we're trying to look at in knowledge. And what we need is greater flexibility in the tools to take a different view, to experiment, to make mistakes. One of the biggest values of putting a bunch of things, a bunch of stickies up on a wall is, oh, that doesn't work. That grouping is all wrong. I need to regroup it this way. And then we get hung up by the physical complexity or the mental gymnastics we have to go through to change that grouping, when that's where a computer should be useful. So that we can make mistakes, observe from the mistakes, learn, reapply, make more mistakes, learn, reapply, and eventually get somewhere intelligent. And that's, I think, the game. And I'll shut up now.
Yeah, I think the mistake part is, you all know my proclivity to typos, and that's one of the things I love about Tinderbox is, it will accept the typo, it will work with your typo, and then once you found it, you can fix it, and it kind of automatically doesn't barf on you when you try to fix it, and it actually will grow with you as you learn and as you adapt. It's super powerful in that regard, and incredibly flexible. Okay, so we're about I don't know, 22 minutes into today, or 52 minutes into today's conversation. We can keep going down this path, or we can ask or answer any other questions that people may have. I'd love to talk about Steve's requirement stuff a little bit too. So Steve, go ahead.
Well, before we move on to anything, I put into the chat a tool that I use, and it's free, works on Macs and Windows machines. It's amazing that this company makes this very powerful product free. But when I was talking about, 10 different algorithms and 10 of layouts and 10 different parameters, I was somewhat referring to the product YED. And if you've never used it, there's like another software product I also know and love. It does take a little bit of a learning curve, but a lot of value out of it. And incredibly, it is free. And it's as sort of a vanity project, I would love to work with somebody who might want to take a portion of Tinderbox outline, which is XML underneath, and convert it to the GraphML standard that is used by YED, and be able to basically have all the elements from a portion of a Tinderbox document and be able to present it in YED and be able to use the powerful layout tools available there. I'm not much of a programmer in XML to be able to do that, but it also has the issues of flattening, so if Tinderbox were to add a feature of flattening, it would be helpful in sort of combining these two tools together.
Interesting. Okay, fantastic. Thank you. A couple reactions to what you just said though too is one on the learning curve. I mean, that's a real thing, and that's again part of the issue why, especially in these early learning stages, why I personally am gravitating more to Tinderbox is Tinderbox is kind of, for me at least, is that perfect balance of, now that I've finally learned it, is that perfect balance of being able to focus on my knowledge and less on the tool. But that, getting over that learning curve is a big deal. And for all of these different applications, and then getting them to talk to each other too is yet another learning curve. Other comments as well, but I like this. Yeah. I'll take a look. David Eddy.
Steve, what was the environment you're working in? The technical environment? I heard
Pardon?
I heard Office 365 or some dirty
So
words like that.
I was a consultant for
Dynamics
30 years working in the Microsoft space, worked for a Microsoft partner, a variety of them over the last 10 years. So Dynamics 365 is really my area of expertise, primarily the customer engagement.
And what is Dynamics?
It's Microsoft's enterprise cloud-based tools. They've got an ERP offering. They've got a customer service, field service,
all dancing, all knowing, all wonderful. You don't have to answer that.
I love Microsoft for their capabilities, but sometimes in implementation and support, they're a little challenged.
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head though earlier when you were introducing the work you were doing, in that it's not like you're writing the code from ground up, but you're taking the tool, you're taking the tool set that Microsoft Dynamics gives you, and that you're then spending your time and effort to configure it to meet the requirements that your business needs. And you're able to use that tool set at an enterprise level, aka your company can interact with millions of people or hundreds of thousands of people simultaneously. That concept is really no different than leveraging the tool set of Tinderbox, but yet for an audience of one or maybe a handful, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? But the same mentality is there. We get a collection of tools to achieve a particular purpose, and what we need to do is learn how to configure those tools to achieve and meet the purpose of either me, the individual, me, my past self, me, my future self, or the small team that we're working together to do it. And the larger the team, the more enterprise grade the tools need to be to have larger scale. But we're talking about the same stuff. You're smiling, Mr. Anderson. You want to comment on that? You're on mute. Mark, you're on mute.
Not really, though. I was recalling the fact that, of course, one of your key collaborators is your future self.
Yes.
Who will forget everything you know now.
Yeah, it's amazing your level of your amnesia, or what I'll often call corporate Alzheimer's, that even your future self can have, or your to what your past self was doing.
Oh God.
Yeah. David, you know about corporate Alzheimer's?
I worked on a single application. I put in the chat a 3,000-year-old banking application, and it actually, this is why this issue comes up in every single one of these sessions of what does that damn word mean? Now, to me, future self, past self, whatever. So this is my 40-year obsession with naming standards. Has not been addressed. ChatGPT is not even remotely close to it. And on this application, they had what they called a data dictionary, which I have a copy of. It was 2 4-inch binders with a single sheet of paper for every single data element, field, column, whatever you want to call it, in this application. A 3,000-year-old application. And if someone had asked me, was there a data dictionary for this application, I would have said no. Except when the project manager dumped this physical documentation on me, lo and behold, there were pages in my handwriting.
Oh, that's funny.
and now, I mean, I just think of how these discussions every week, the Tinderbox is basically putting supercomputer capabilities in the hands of individuals. And it's astonishing. It's remarkable. And the only real forward progress is not made by massive enterprise teams. That's just running the meter. The progress is made by individuals who know the difference. Chuck, I mean, it's come up multiple times. You keep some stuff in DevonThink and some stuff in Tinderbox. Of course, if you drop dead and someone tried to make sense, would they know where to look? And the answer is, of course not. And it's lucky if you can remember where to look.
Yeah.
So that's my, I mean, so this is so much fun.
Awesome.
But then that is the advantage of something like DevonThink or Tinderbox, is if you use them at all, when I forget something, I've got a few tools that will most likely get me back to what I forgot. And
But
that's the real difference.
You can't do conceptual search in digital, because there's all you have to do is it's one character difference, and search ain't going to find it.
Well, and I want to go back to the point that Mark Anderson made earlier too. It's like we wait for this serendipity moment, and the reality is you can create your own serendipity. And I think that's what Lumen was attempting to do with his strategy, and what I found I can do with Tinderbox is, once I've got that information in, and to Chuck's point too, I can forget about it, and then as I continue to go through the process, Tinderbox will remind me, well, you've already created a note with that name. And oh, by the way, you've already got paragraphs of text that have already been cited in your own words that you can actually use for the next article you're writing about a similar topic. And then that's where then the beauty of the capabilities that Mark Bernstein's put into the tool, that's where then taggers and highlighting, the highlighter utilities really start to sting, because then Tinderbox is in fact contriving serendipity for you as you're going through your knowledge journey. And I think that's, but again, going back to the point that Mark and I were talking about before, this one gentleman that we're interacting with on the forum, there seems to be a hesitancy of getting started. And I think one of the recommendations Mark Anderson was making is, and I think that, what was his comment today? I don't know what my end game is going to be. What was it, Mark? Yeah, he basically said, I don't know where it's going to end up.
Yeah. Well, that's why I suggested to him, what's your source material? Are you looking at, I don't know, molecular structure? Are you looking at, you know, fifth century manuscripts, because all of these things in some way, shape or form. Or say, are you looking at health data? You see Bruce's area. Well, you're going to have things like HIPAA constraints. So maybe I can't just tip everything in, you know, I can't just tip everything into the document. You have to be selective. And it starts to make you think, okay, so how do I extract, or how do I cross-reference? And what you're doing is you're tiptoeing into what, if I said to you, add metadata, might cause some to run screaming from the room. But that's what you're doing. Plus the fact that, you know, it's, you know, if you wanted it, you should have put something on it. In the sense of, how the hell do you hope to find it if you persistently refuse to identify it in any way, other than half remembering in some weird spatial way that you did it, you know, 2 months ago, and it was on the top left corner of the screen when you last saw it, which is kind of how our memory often works. And there is a fallacy too. I think, I mean, I spent a lot of time, sort of end of the 90s, early 2000s doing image database work. And it was that thing where people were finding that controlled vocabularies work really, really bad for tagging. Because does the brown dog go in the brown pot or the dog pot? And actually the whole thing falls apart. And so you go to folksonomies that have that problem of their own. The real thing to take out of it is just to accept that, you know, actually these things tend to be multi-pass processes. You put in your first guess and you come back and review. Because unless you're really lucky, you know, like, you know, someone lends you a jigsaw and the pieces are all in the box. Often they're not. So you know, you take whatever subject it is, you pull the pieces together, and then you find, there's something missing, or there is, you know, there's something there, but I can't quite put a handle on it. And it's only by a bit more introspection of what you have that you begin to see a structure that wasn't there. And that to me is part of the serendipity. And that doesn't necessarily come by following process. And we are, I don't know, I think we're slaves to process. Every time I hear that, I always think of that scene from Monty Python where they said, how, O Lord, shall we push off? Because that's process to a T. You're not doing anything useful. You're just merely following the roadmap. But it gives comfort, and I think that is a challenge with knowledge work, even for people who've done the same thing before, and even for, you know, it's no respecter of depth of knowledge or intellect. It's more just, it's work. You know, can't I just tip it into a box and press the answer button? But in the age of, you know, artificial stupidity, you press the button, the answer is 42. So now you have an answer and you're none the wiser as to whether it's correct or what it means. So, you know, actually just getting down and into your information, your data, call it what you will, I think is important. And I think giving yourself the space to just fail multiple times over and expect to be part of the process is probably one of the most helpful things. I mean, you don't have to tell anybody else. It's just not, it's when you get to the point of thinking, okay, this has taught me nothing. I either need to restructure this, or I need to change all these attribute values or something. It can occur in various ways. But at that point, instead of just, you know, kicking yourself and thinking, oh, I've wasted a week or whatever, thinking, no, actually what I've learned is this is a complete dead end. I shouldn't waste any more time in this. But I have sitting in front of me all the things I need to construct a route out of this. And that's something that our sort of linearized education doesn't teach us. It just keeps us pushing on the pool door at the end of the corridor and wondering why we're not getting anywhere.
I'm glad we recorded that. You've got some really good zingers in there. What, artificial stupidity? That was a good one too.
Well, I don't mean to. I probably sound disrespectful in the sense that, you know, there's some really interesting stuff being done, but it's actually nothing to do with what, you know, the code that people are writing. It's us as human beings in the way that we rush. We're fooled by the verisimilitude of the output. But I'm reminded that probably if you use ChatGPT in Estonian or something, it probably won't be as good as it is in American. And indeed, I did a lecture for someone out on the West Coast last week, and they sent me the video with the auto transcript. And I'm reminded it does not cope with accents like mine at all well. It was like a rather hilarious Monty Python skit if you read the thing. And I understand that because it wasn't trained on voices like mine. But it just shows how fragile for all their supposed intelligence, these things are, and so they're a long way from the general intelligence that we suppose.
So
Mr.
Mark,
Eddie, you still have your hand up.
Mark, tell us what you think about ChatGPT. Never mind, I withdraw the question.
No, I'll be honest. I mean, I haven't tried it. But I don't have a need to try it. I understand that it works at what it does. I have no need for what it does, and so I'm quite happy for people to go and doing it. If I have a reservation, I'm saddened on humanity's behalf of the amount of money that will be wasted on someone trying to get this far ahead of someone else in that sector, when there are so many other useful and more tractable things that we could be spending research money on.
Well, I actually I teach at Cal Poly, and one of the teachers did a nice kind of hour and a half opportunity for us to discuss, the use of ChatGPT in a classroom environment. And one of the biggest fears is students will get their essays written using it and all that. And it's funny because the only difference there is now someone's not getting paid $50 to write somebody's essay, and the computer is going to do it for free. But the other difference that came out of it is the realization that we have to remind students that the point of going to school is to learn to think and to build the neural pathways. And when someone else is doing your homework for you, you're not achieving that. As is the case of the 1997, you might know this better. I can't remember I think it was Snowden in 1997. He did a study on French nuns, and they were all PhDs and had like almost no Alzheimer's or mental cognition failures at all. And they attributed it to education, and to ongoing use of the neural pathways that kept their minds clear. And so that was one of the things that came up with the students. And the big one was the insight that Mark just alluded to this, the ChatGPT, it's only trained on what you fed it. And if you're producing new knowledge, it's not going to come back with new knowledge. So for instance, I fed it a question for my class to find mobile marketing, and its answer was abjectly wrong and uncited, but yet it was wrong with such authority that no one would know it was wrong, because it was damn convincing with the way it was conveying its wrong answer. And I think those are going to be some of the things that we're going to be struggling with.
I'd like to come back to what Mark was talking about. It's not ChatGPT, which there's tons to be said about that. But maybe this is not the best time.
Yeah.
So the thing I've been struggling about, and Michael's been very kind and generous with some time in helping me out, is that I've got things I want to do. I've got a book project. I have a course plan that I've been developing, and it sounds like those are useful things to use Tinderbox for. I have some ad hoc methods and some tools that I have been using to make progress that may or may not be sufficient or better or optimal, or whatever. But I remain intrigued by Tinderbox. And Mark, I really appreciate your comments about that. Part of it is trying to figure things out. As still a new user to it, who is not new to tools like this or technology, and if I had to start writing action code, I'd be cool with that. I still struggle with the how I take the next step for trying to figure out what I'm trying to do and how the tool can help me. And I can look at like some of the tutorial stuff, and I said, okay, I can see some features, but that's not my problem. So it doesn't map well for that. And part of it reminds me of, I have over the years probably gone the earlier edge of people reading about like Zettelkasten and stuff. And the 90+% of it, and I think this has been said more than once in this group, is you write down a bunch of notes and the machine does stuff, and it's got some searches of tagging, and then your life is wonderful, right? And
Yes.
the reality of Luhmann's work and of the more serious work with it is that like Luhmann was sitting down every day to like look at the new notes and how they fit in with the old notes and thinking about his stuff. And seems pretty clear when you know that that's where the value is for it. And the machine can accelerate some of that and help with it and keep track of it. And you can carry it around in your pocket or whatever. And so when I'm trying to, I've got to get things done. So, we got close to semester classes started. I put aside my project to try to do the course planning with Tinderbox because I had to do a lecture for it. So what I'm interested in is advice, and I think it's more broadly than just me, on how to take a small step that looks like it's going in the right direction. And then here are a couple things from there, not 10, that you might try for different kinds of things that you might be trying to do. And now I'm ranting and I'll stop.
I think it's very interesting because what it's made me realize is an observation I made on the form where I was slightly wrong in terms of saying, where do you want to get to? Because perhaps one of the things, I mean, definitely in experimenting with these things, give yourself a hard edge target, which is not, the life, universe and everything, but and not even perhaps a full semester's worth of something, of saying, can I make a week's worth of material? What does it look like? What did I need that I didn't have when I started? So it's basically using the problem to kickstart the abstraction process. What are the building blocks I need? And one of the problems I think that comes out of the map view being Tinderbox's default view is we get stuck on the visuals. And quite a lot of things, actually, really what you want to be doing is effectively creating attributes as sort of silos of information you need, because a lot of the search and sort of recitative of things will be making lists. But if the list it gives you everything or nothing, that doesn't help you. So part of the thing is thinking. So say for instance, you're well placed because you're quite comfortable with the coding aspects. You understand the sort of list part of it. So the question is more, what do I need to make a list of in order to do the things I want? So it's helpful to sort of at the end. So what is it I want the thing that I'm going to make, my course planner? What do I actually want it to do? Do I want it to make web pages to put on the intranet for my students that actually have links right through to the references? Or does it just want to say, you need to be in this classroom at this time next week? And that doesn't mean you have to fix to that as a target, but I think it helps you calibrate what on earth it is you're trying to do. Otherwise, you try to eat the whole thing at once and it's too much. And having got an idea of the bits and pieces you want, then, and as I say, you're better placed than many, having a sort of that sense of a sort of software type of abstraction. Okay, so what are the atomic parts of this? So what adheres to the note and what adheres, say, to an individual attribute? That allows me to grab a whole lot of relevant notes. So the readings for next week's class. How would I know what they are? And if you start asking yourself those questions, you're going to, oh, right, I'm going to need one of those, I need this. And it doesn't matter if you get it, if you get it wrong in Tinderbox, the great thing is, unlike using a sort of formal database, you haven't got to rip the whole lot up and start over. You
Sure.
can even leave the CRUD in place, so though it is a good idea to turn up. And the other thing is, I would commend to everyone is, and I don't do as often as I should do myself. I mean, I normally do it for other people. It says, but make test documents. Make the smallest possible document you can that shows you that the idea you had is achievable. Oh, right. If I put this in at this end of the hopper, what comes out at the end is a list of next week's class assignments. Then you know that works without anything else interfering with it. And then you can shim that back into the larger whole. Because I think that's another problem. Unwittingly, we often plan projects, especially when they have outputs like that are too large. Whereas you sort of know that if someone has given it to you as a coding project, you would have started incredibly small. You just start building all those little bits. You knew the moving parts. So another way of saying this is to sort of take a slightly object-oriented approach to your problem. What's it actually made of? What are the atomic parts of a course schedule? Or I can't remember what the other thing you mentioned is. But we can do that. We're quite good at that kind of thing. If we stop worrying about whether we're being clever about it and whether we get the answer right first time, we're actually remarkably good at that, I think, as humans. And then then you sort of build out your test to the first version, and you duly find out that actually you missed out some rather important stuff, or actually you didn't need that stuff you thought you needed. But that's over time the way I approach it. I mean, does that help?
There are some things in there that I can certainly work with, and so thank you for that. I think that there's a useful approach on rethinking what I'm trying to do there, and maybe when I come back to try to do it sort of seriously. I think one of the challenges, if I think a little bit about my experience versus newcomer experience on it, is that I've got, and I'll just say this for concreteness. So I'm a pretty power Emacs user, and I've been that way for a long time. And there's a lot of stuff that for the kinds of things you were just talking about, I know how to do in Emacs. And so part of my curiosity is, how can I go beyond that when I can sort of I can accomplish my main goals right now in a reasonable way. But as we were talking about, and I think Steve got at a lot of this, is where can I sort of get some new ways to look at relationships, at things, how they go together, and so on, that Tinderbox does that I'm not going to replicate. And there's plenty of room for that. I'm not saying that they're interchangeable tools by any means. But that's, and again, that's the, and trying to figure out what I don't see in terms of, oh, I could do this. And that would be really interesting in my overall goal, but I hadn't thought about the problem that way, as being part of the way into some of this.
So when for me, what's helped is most of the time I think about, this is what I want to do. I think about the output that I want. And then I think about what information do I need to fulfill that output. And I make the general assumption that if it's text-based information, there invariably is going to be a way to do it with Tinderbox, because Tinderbox is inherently a text transformation tool. And if you have text in attributes in Tinderbox, there are more than enough functions to move that information around to present it in a way that you want, either in a output template or in attribute browser or something. So I would start with, what's my output? And if it's text-based output, 99% of the time, there's going to be a way to get that text into the output you want. Now, you may not know how to do that. And that's what, to the graciousness of Mark Anderson at 3 a.m., 2 o'clock mornings for the last 2 years has helped me be able to get there and becoming out independent and getting more often than not the output that I want. But so to that end, start with that. So here's my input, here's my output. Trust that there are action code and operators and export capabilities that can get me from there to there. And then you can start iterating through, start with the forum, and, and Mark and myself or others will say, okay, we'll try this, try that. And that's how you get there. And after a while, you start realizing there are some core basic utilities that, are just common, like the .each operator gets you there a lot of the way when you're iterating against lists or sets. That's
I'd add one thing. I'm very well. He's got his hand up. I mean, do you want to jump in on this, or is this a new point, Steve?
I really want to jump in on this from coming from a totally different direction. The question is, why do we think learning Tinderbox is a solitary pursuit? My point being, and I'll take this from the Jewish tradition, when people were trying to understand Talmud, which is a very complex and lots of pieces are missing, it's not done as an individual pursuit. It's typically done in pairs, where people, sort of wrestle with things. So the answer, another way of answering the question, is not about, is it there in Tinderbox? Is there a special working formula or something like that, but to work with somebody else, and they may not be that much more knowledgeable about Tinderbox, but working with somebody else and being able to voice, what are my challenges? What am I trying to achieve? What is something that is not in my current tools that I think might be in Tinderbox? And, those kinds of, in conversation, I think you'll be able to get faster to what you want. Documentation is great, but conversation is greater.
But it starts with what you want, right? I do think you need to start with the
Teasing that out. I mean,
a lot of the times
I might
people
have a
don't-
very vague idea of what I
Right.
want when I start, but another person can help me to maybe tease that apart. My words are lacking there,
Well,
but
No,
to
no,
be able to get it
absolutely.
to a better point.
Yeah,
I
that's really
couldn't agree more. Articulate, well, it's that classic thing. Often, well, the other way this comes out is the act of explaining the problem that's bugged you all afternoon to somebody else makes you realize in the moment you know the answer. In the same way that one of the arguments for documentation is if you can't write it down, you don't understand it. So pushing yourself through that. But I also go and circle back to something else for women, which is that to a certain extent, that for somebody else, it might be the answer is that what you need is to know Emacs really well. So don't assume that something you know and use really well is not a perfectly reasonable solution. One of the questions you might ask if you're feeling, why can't or why shouldn't I do this in Tinderbox, is to ask yourself, okay, well, using the tool that I know well, what is it not giving me? If it's actually giving you most of what you want, then in a sense, I wouldn't worry too much. By all means, learn other tools as well, but not from the perspective of that it's probably going to be better, but understanding another way to do the same thing, which might take some of the pressure off. Because to a certain extent, the danger is taking something I understand really well, trying to replicate it in something else. You're setting yourself up for failure. And none of us like that. And then you might, like us not, we give up because we run out of time or energy or interest. So maybe in your case, one useful sort of reflection to do is saying, okay, I know how to do this using this tool or set of tools. I know how to do this task. Does it give me everything I want? What doesn't it give me? And why is it that it can't give me that? I mean, it might be just that it needs a bit more of the thing you're used to. It might be that, no, this tool or this process can never give me this sort of output or this aspect of it because, it's entirely text-based and I need a picture. It's a very trite example. And I think some of those questions may help burrow into, or giving you the impetus to recreate something that, from your own description, in a sense, already know how to do, which is great. But it also means it's really hard if, in a sense, you know how to do it. I've been in similar situations. See, well, why am I trying to do this in X when I know how to do it in Y? And I know you say so. I'm trying to learn X, and thinking, really, I've been at this for several days and it's still not working. So it's all too easy to find a reason to not go through. I mean, I don't know if that helps either, but it might be another way into the problem.
That's a really interesting thing. Because I think what I'm wondering about, and this has been my big wonder, is are there things that Tinderbox does that give me a lot more leverage on something than I currently have, even though I can currently do the thing, or I think I'm doing it okay with what I can do in Emacs. And Emacs is programmable, so I can write all the code I want to do whatever I need and add on for it. And it also has a whole bunch of people who have fooled around with doing Zettelkasten and stuff and note taking and things that I don't find entirely satisfactory. So just that part, put it aside. I like Michael's idea about, and this is not the way I've thought about Tinderbox, probably a helpful one, is to think about what concrete output from organizing something might be helpful to me. And that's more interesting in the class context than it is in the book context, because I don't think I'm going to write a book in Tinderbox. I'm going to write the text in Emacs. But the enormous pile of research that I'm doing is sort of the question about how I do that. And what I'm interested in for the notes that I've been building up now over a period of a small number of years with the book project is really understand. It's a history project, history of random numbers. And so there's no way to completely focus on, I'm doing the history of this piece now because I'm going to read a paper, several months later that has a historical reflection on what happened, that I have to go back and reinterpret what I did. And that's part of the fun for it. But thinking about how to do that, or even the process of a timeline where over time you just accumulate a bunch of things and you go back and you look at the timeline and see this maybe a kind of view that you've used or appreciate. It's all of a sudden you see that thing A happened just before thing B. And it doesn't tell you that there was a cause and effect relationship, but historically speaking, that could be a really interesting thing to put together. And certainly if thing B happened before thing A, it's like, oh, that changes the story completely.
Well, and also too, I'll go to one other point on that is, Malcolm Gladwell has this concept called blink too, that when you play the Lumen role, or any of us as we get, when we get deep into our knowledge, it's sometimes, it's kind of like that idea of the Zen koan of what's the hand of the sound of one hand clapping. You get so close to your topic that when you were to see that relationship between the dates, that might inspire that serendipity that Mark Anderson was talking about. You may blink and have the answer, and it may take you another 3 months to really realize, was it really the date associations was the answer, or was there some other bunch of knowledge I was bringing to the table that I inherently had seeped into me that brought that answer to me because I've been so close to my data. And I think that's, so for me, what Tinderbox allows me to do is it gets me about as close to my data as any other application or experience that I've ever had. And I think that's one of its powers.
One other interesting observation that's really interesting hearing when talk about this is that given the expertise you have, you are not like many of us so dependent on the crutch of a UI to do things. Which I hope that makes sense to you. I mean, the point is, if you know how to code something, you don't need knobs and switches to do what.
And you don't need to see it.
It's much more reliable.
You don't need to see it.
I don't have to see it.
Connections, yeah.
But an interesting counter to that, and I think this is partly what I hear played out, is that so that bit. So the question is, what might I be missing? Because yes, I can type pound hash star whatever, and it all arrives, but it doesn't tell me what I don't know. And this sort of loops right back in a sense to where we started with, which is the magic of the sort of Tinderbox map as it is as a thinking space, as opposed to a drawing space, which is sort of where we came in. But as a thinking space where I can just put these things, I always go back to the jigsaw metaphor. I'm going to put the brown things over there. I'm going to put the green things over here. I'm going to put the edge pieces in this corner. I don't really know how they fit together yet, but what I know is they are not each other.
Yeah.
And you can start to do that loose, soft associative work.
And on that concluding remark, I think that's the distinction between maps as we know it today and the idea of a flattened map. Is maps as we know it today is a thinking space, a discovery space, and the flattened map, and we may need to come up with a new idea. For me, it's a lot of it's thinking, but it really is the purpose of drawing that flow diagram. And not drawing in the sense of like, using shapes, circles and squares, and drawing lines in between them. And yes, there's thinking there, but there's thinking with a purpose, not thinking with discovery, right? And as you're doing thinking with purpose, invariably just new discovery will come out of that for sure. But it's 90% purpose and 10% discovery versus traditional Tinderbox map view, I think is 90% discovery and 10% purpose. At least that's how it comes to my mind on that. All right, well, go ahead.
Michael, just very quick. Would it be interesting to have one of these sessions where a main topic is showing some examples, sort of on a small scale, of using Tinderbox maps as a thinking space?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think we should explore with that. I mean, and we should start. And there was another, some might argue it's a snarky comment that I made on the forum earlier this week, though, and where one of our community members kept asking for give me examples, give me examples, give me examples. And at some point I had to stay. I'm like, examples have a cost, right? And when you're asking for my real work examples, well, those examples might come at the cost of somebody else owns them. It's confidential. There's value in them I don't want to be giving away. Or there's code there I'm not wanting to be giving away. Or then they're saying, well, don't, take out the confidential stuff, take out the stuff you don't want to share. Well, that could be as much work to do than
More.
not, or more. And creating synthetic data is even more. And then also thinking through all of the abstraction that I hadn't necessarily documented or was conscious of when I was creating my initial stuff to get you that demo could end up being 3x times more work. And so there, I think one thing we need to be careful of with when we get into this is, demos aren't free, examples aren't free. They have a very significant cost.
Well, maybe this takes back to youth. I mean, it's a case of what you're really arguing for is a round of I'll show you mine if you'll show me yours.
Yeah.
Because in a sense, the funny thing, one thing I would say is I think back to when there used to be Tinderbox weekends, which was some while back. We used to sort of a small bunch of people would meet up and talk about stuff. But one of the really interesting things, everyone would stand up and they'd show their homework, and the first thing they say is, "I'm sorry, it's such a mess," and then show you something that was actually wonderful in the context of what you were looking at. And so I think we all have this reservation. So, well, I've made it frightfully messy, but that's not really the point. But both the charm and the interest on one hand is that they are quite messy. They're not designed for visual prettiness or being used as a sort of like a big infographic. The other slight problem is that if you see somebody else, especially their map, shorn of other context, one of the problems is that I would say over time there are very few maps I've seen that I've really understood without having to ask the person quite what this bit or that bit was. And what that shows is just how personal, how closely it's mapped to their stuff up here. So on the one level, it makes absolute sense. And I've definitely been through that phase myself of thinking my problem was that I didn't have enough examples to look at. I think I'm beginning to realize that that was probably a wrong assumption on my part. It's easy to say after the fact, of course. That's a bit like saying, well, you just need to try harder. So it sounds like an unkind observation to make. I'm very conscious of the point that Michael made, that if it's difficult to make if it's difficult to sort of demo your own stuff, it's really, really hard to make a meaningful, fake, completely mocked up demo, because trying to simulate real world data is remarkably hard. So the easiest way to do something, and it was a suggestion I gave in the same thread that's been referred to at some distances. Look, take some of your stuff, just throw it all in the bucket. See what floats to the top. What did you get? What did you not get? Take some of your primary source material. Can you see anything in there? Just paste in some stuff you're used to working with. Is it tractable? Why is it not tractable? Why can't you find anything? So what do you therefore need to add by way of indexing? What's missing in it? And it's that is another good way of getting started. Yeah. It is just sort of, in a sense, taking some of the stuff that you would regard as your source material for the project, and, for want of a better word, dumping it into Tinderbox. Not trying to do too much in it, just putting it in there, and it will be a mess. And so it won't mean much.
And on that note, Win, I again, pulling the snarkiness back a little bit, I'd love to do, and let's maybe that's our session for next week. And if we could start with some content or some ideas and to play with them and to start thinking about what can we come out of this? And and associate that. Or and it doesn't have to be you. And if anybody has a collection of philosophical thoughts or ideas or structural or process planning or whatever, let's throw them into a map view and see what Rorschach image comes out. And
I'm going to volunteer Steve to offer up something.
that would be fun. And then I tend to not want to. We are about 8 minutes over, so we should set this up. But I do want to conclude today's session with one practical Tinderbox example, so we can just look at the tool itself. And going to Wynn's example of grading. I too, Wynn, am starting school on Monday, and I've had to give up making my really super pretty course planning methods, with Tinderbox, just because I gotta deliver a class on Monday. But be that as it may, there's a combination between, and so in some respects, I'm jumping into PowerPoint because I have to, because I haven't been able to get my pretty Tinderbox slides done. But the going back and forth between the tools serves its purpose and has value. Likewise, going back between my school's learning management system and Tinderbox has its value. So one example, for instance, is I've gone through and mapped out all of the weeks of my next 15-week course and started dropping in, here's the lesson plan of what I want to talk there. Here's some of the key points I want to make. Here's the quiz they're going to have to take. Here's some other things. And then I've got a guest speaker coming in on this week. So I'm doing that and then pulling it into the LMS system of the school. And I'll show you something else that I find pretty interesting on that. And then as I was working through my syllabus, and I showed you this before, but using templating, and of course I let it crash at that point. But using templating, you're able to open up some of these elements. I won't do the whole thing, but one of the challenges I had to quickly come up with is I've got all of my assignments, and there are grading points for each one of those assignments. And what I wanted to do is quickly build a table to be able to do that. So I could use Tinderbox tabling. I didn't have time, so I hacked in a quick little table, and I'll just demonstrate this for the purposes of the do that. But if look at here, I said, let's grab some action code. And I said, let's create some variables. So I've got individual assignments, I've got discussion assignments, and I've got a spelling error there, but Tinderbox doesn't care. I've got group assignments, and then here I'm actually creating a percentage mockup. And essentially what I'm saying is, Tinderbox, go collect the children of your individual assignments, discussion assignments, and group assignments, grab the point values of those, create another variable that creates the precision that I want in terms of the output, then build me a table so that I can now have a table that I'm going to drop into my syllabus that says individual assignments are 57% of your grade, 215 points. Discussion points are 16% of your grade, 60 points. All of that's being generated from these notes here. And then I was able to then just grab the export code, paste that into the LMS, and hit publish, and I'm done. That all took maybe about 20 minutes. And that's the kind of stuff that you can do really quickly with Tinderbox. Is it a perfect syllabus? Are other aspects of my course a complete mess? No, it's not a perfect syllabus. And yes, other aspects of my course are a complete mess. But yet it's incrementally getting me there. And I think, again, this is one of the really powerful things of the tool and of doing the type of work that we're all trying to do with it. So I'll kind of leave us with that. Comments, questions, or thoughts before we close out on that?
Very quick one. I've just, by way of trying to answer Wim's thing, it's in a thread on the forum, but I put a link to a map where I literally, just as preps for a lecture on hypertext for the web. So probably something not most people here are familiar with, but what it was me just thinking onto a screen for about 15 minutes. As it happened, I then had to give up and do some PowerPoint stuff. But that time was not wasted. None of those notes, to my recollection, had any text. None had any user attributes. All I was doing was basically thinking onto the screen. And in that case, I'd actually put a date, for instance, into the title, because I didn't want to faff around with with dates. I just wanted them visible on the screen so I could say, oh, right, this is a bit before that. How does this, where's this, where's the rough story here? And that, I think, hopefully ties back to what Michael was saying about maps as a thinking space, and that probably being where their heart lies.
Yeah, and let's just share that so the people that are watching the channel can see that. So this is the image you just shared through the chat, and you literally just barfed on a page, got some names, laid it out, and that's what you ended up with.
Yeah, and that gave me just the sort of thing, and then I had to do something in PowerPoint because reasons. Anyway, but that the time it took for me to do that. And I mean, this was sort of stuff I knew, but I just needed to see it outside my brain to sort of put it roughly in order. And I hasten to add, the list you see there is not exhaustive. That other systems are available.
But on that note, let's circle back to the very beginning of today's session before we close out. So on this note, this is map view as we traditionally have in a Tinderbox. And what you're seeing here is an adornment that gives you this kind of visual background so the hypertext pioneers. So we use this adornment called hypertext pioneers to visually have a representation in the map view to kind of visually group these people. And then in here, you've got Bush, and you've got an article he wrote, which, by the way, if no one's ever read it, it's 8,000 words of denseness, but it's wickedly good. And then some other stuff that comes out of that and interesting. Now, to talk about what I mean when I talk about a flattened map view is let me show you this, and then I'm going to pop up. So let's say we were to take this map view real quick and just kind of reproduce it. So you said we'll call it hypertext pioneers for that purpose, and then you had some notes here. We'll just do it really quickly so we can wrap up today. And so let's just say you had that. The challenge with this look in traditional Tinderbox map view is when you go to the outline, and you'll see it's all rooted in the outline. And so then if I go up here and I create a new note and I call it hypertext pioneers, and I now embed those notes into the container we're going to call hypertext pioneers, and I go back to the map view, I've now lost my flattened map. And so and again, for the discovery part of that view of traditional map view, that's great. But for my purposes of the way I use Tinderbox, because I write reports and I'm really focused on output, can I publish that 400-page document or that 20-page article or that PowerPoint file? I want to be able to do, and I think this is where this idea, I want to be able to essentially have my cake and eat it too, rather than using the adornment hypertext pioneers. I want to be able to have that guy's name up here and that guy's name on top of that, flatten it out, do the associations, and then unflatten it back into the outline. Or better yet, start in the outline, flatten an outline, go back to the outline, rather than going from map view to an outline. And I think that was the insight that Mark Anderson had this week, is I was going the wrong direction. I was thinking map view to outline, and he's like, no, you got to reorientate your thinking. What you're really saying is you want to go from outline to map. And that's what a flattened map view is, as a concluding kind of statement. Anything to add to that, Mark? Or
no, I think that's it. I hasten to add that the view that we've just alluded to doesn't exist yet. But
yes, it doesn't. But that's the conversation.
And it's just the fact that it's only really in last week or so that I've realised that actually it really does need to be a different view. Otherwise, all that's going to happen is it's going to sort of wreck the map in its other form, because you're trying to push too much in. So for the sake of this argument, you can see in a Tinderbox map, you can see, if you want, some of the map below.
Not
but
to
it was
mention,
never designed to show sort of 100 items in the map below. And so what you might do and what's practical scale very badly very quickly. So really there probably is scope for a sort of a more drawing view.
Well, and also leaving on this one, not to mention that, you know, the genius of Mark Bernstein is his ability to maintain backward compatibility with a 20-year-old piece of software, right? You can take a story space file that was done 20 years ago and open it up in a modern day Tinderbox.
Oh, but you can take the 1987 version. You can take a Windows version of Afternoon a Story and put it in Tinderbox on a Mac, and it'll open.
Right. And
Story space on a Mac.
And tell me what piece of software has that kind of backward forward longevity. I've never seen it. So one of the things Mark will do with this is he'll interpret everything we're talking about and then make sure we don't break ourselves. Like I could imagine the horrific things of if we try to shoehorn this flattened map view into traditional map structure, the horrors that might occur to other people's backward compatible maps that we as a community aren't thinking through, but Mark is thinking through on our behalf. And that comes back to the very beginning of our conversation today of Steve Harf and software system requirements, right? There's a lot of requirements that are unknown to the users, to which experts of tools like Mr. Bernstein thinks about and considers for us, which we need to be gratefully appreciative of.
I'm going to drop, but I'll say goodbye. I literally have to go.
Thank you, Mark.
Just say thanks all. I'm going to save the chat.
Great week.
Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.